Welcome to the My Voice to Story podcast. I'm your host, Cielo. I'm a television media storyteller turned entrepreneur. My Voice to Story is an interview podcast for young adults who struggle with human anxieties and finding comfort in their experiences. In each episode, I conduct unfiltered interviews with extraordinary individuals from top business executives to everyday folks about the obstacles they've encountered in their lives and how they rise above them. Listen in for tangible tips and inspiring stories that will help you overcome your anxieties and thrive in the face of adversity. So let's get started. This episode is brought to you by Fiverr. Fiverr is an online marketplace for freelance services. I am a very proud sponsor to Fiverr because Fiverr has been part of my journey as an entrepreneur since day one. And I'm going to get very real about this. When I first launched the Plenty W publication in 2017, I needed a lot of professional help. And honestly, I could not afford to spend thousands of dollars to start a business. How could I? I had just quit CNN and I was broke. So when I discovered Fiverr, it was life-changing. It blew my mind that I could purchase professional services at a very affordable price. Using Fiverr has been life-saving for me in so many occasions. So if you're a student that needs professional help with editing, math homework, writing, or you're just an entrepreneur that just started a business and you're kind of lost, don't really know how to build a website, you need help with marketing, branding, you name it, Fiverr is the way to go. Fiverr right now offers about 1,000 services in more than 200 categories. And trust me, once you start using Fiverr, it becomes addictive. You won't stop. You can head to blentw.com. BlentyW is, of course, the name of our publication. blentw.com/Fiverr. Fiverr. By signing up and using one of the Fiverr services, with our unique link, you will be making your life easier and smarter. And trust me, I guarantee you, you're not going to regret it. Welcome to the My Voice to Story Talks. Today, I'm so excited because it's our first episode, and we cannot think of a better way to start this podcast than by interviewing a very special human being. Hi, Alok. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good too. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me and creating this platform.
So tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. My name is Alok. I'm a gender non-conforming writer and performance artist, and I use they, them pronouns. So in a sentence, that's where do they get their necklace? And I'm sad that people might not be able to see my necklace because it's really fun. A lot of the work that I do is about gender justice and racial justice. But I also write about trauma, healing, and belonging. And I've performed in over 40 countries all across the world at more than 500 venues. And I feel like my gender, like my art practice, kind of resists definition. So it's always fluid and moving around.
And a couple of things I'm going to add, because you're obviously very humble, is that you're the author of Theme in Public, which is a book of poems that you wrote about street harassment that you have experienced as a gender nonconformist person, and you just released a book, Beyond the Gender Binary, that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And I know that in 2019, you were honored as one of NBC's Pride 50 and Out magazine's Out 100. That is amazing. Congrats.
Thank you.
So I want to start our conversation by asking you the definition of the term gender nonconformist. A lot of people might not be very familiar with that term. So what does that specifically mean to you?
Absolutely. So I'll break down a lot of these categories because I understand people might not know about them. So gender nonconforming for me means that I visibly defy what society thinks a man or a woman should look like. So when people see me, they see characteristics typically associated with masculinity and characteristics typically associated with femininity all together. And so they see me and they're like, oh, that person doesn't look like a man or a woman. So I'm visibly gender nonconforming. How I identify is non-binary, meaning that I'm neither a man nor a woman. And it's important that when we use the term non-binary looks and is experienced differently by every different non-binary person. So each person has their own unique gender. It's not just man, woman, other. It's man, woman, millions of others. And a lot of what I'm trying to get my work to actually realize is like, why are you so fixated on my appearance to begin with anyways? And so gender nonconforming is also like a political critique for me of being like, I'm not conforming to this gender system. I'm not interested in a system that requires us to look like a man or woman in order to be considered real worthy.
Wow. Thank you so much for the explanation. I'm sure a lot of listeners have gained a new perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So you usually prefer to be referred by the pronoun they, right?
Yeah.
Is there a specific reason why you chose they?
Right. So they is a gender neutral pronoun. And since I don't identify as a man or a woman, I don't feel comfortable with he or she. They is just a way to acknowledge my gender.
Got it. Let's talk about your activism. You have been one of the most representative and loudest voices of the transgender community. Has that been a lot of pressure for you? Be honest.
It's a lot of pressure because my community is going through a lot of discrimination and a lot of violence right now. So there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of trauma. And when you are a minority, and I'm sure you might be able to understand this, you have very few representatives of your community. And so the stakes are just so much higher because so often I'm required to speak for everyone, even though I can't. I can really only speak to like my experiences, what I've been through. But so many times people will ask me in interviews or in the media, like, can you tell me about all trans people's issues all over the world? And it's like, there's actually millions of us. Like no one person can actually represent. So it's a lot of pressure to like, be honest that I do need to educate myself constantly about what is going on in this country and this world, about all the different intersections of being trans, because there are different issues faced by Black trans women, faced by disabled trans people. You know, each group has their own concerns. So it can feel kind of overwhelming because people have this expectation that you have to be perfect and that you have to be able to know everything all over the world. But it's like, I'm a flawed person. I'm contradictory and I'm figuring it out. And what I've always tried to maintain in my career is that strength doesn't actually come from perfection. Strength comes from interdependence. So what I try to say is like, the reason I'm able to do this public facing work is because I'm connected to so many powerful communities and networks that I can just call people up on the phone and be like, hey, I don't know about this. Can you help me?
Wow, that's incredible. So let's talk now about your bringing. So let's imagine that right now we're in a badass time machine, one very similar to the one used in Back to the Future, and it's taking us to your childhood years. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing. Where did you grow up?
Sure. So I grew up in a small town in Texas called College Station. It was predominantly white, predominantly Christian, and predominantly straight. And so I grew up as an Indian, gender nonconforming, queer, non-Christian. So in every way, I was a minority. And I grew up kind of polarized between two communities. One, the Indian community that I grew up in, and then two, the largely white community that I was friends with or went to public school with. And so the problem was that in the Indian community, there's a lot of homophobia and transphobia that I was experiencing. And then in the white community, there was a lot of racism that I was experiencing. So there was nowhere that I felt like I could be all parts of myself. And so I grew up with a lot of trauma because I had to pretend to be something I was not for the first 18 years of my life.
So how did you find out you were transgendered? Take me back to that moment. How old were you?
Right. So when people ask me that question, I always try to return the question and say, would we ever ask a cisgender person, when did you know that you were cisgender? We think that being trans or being queer is something that like happens, not something that is. And that always stabilizes the idea that people are born straight and born cis and become trans or become queer, which is actually not true. People become straight as much as they become queer. People become cis as much as they become trans, because when we're born, actually, we're assigned genders. We are not genders, because gender is a cultural and social ritual. We divide people into one of two categories. We say, play with these toys, wear these clothes, like these colors, do these jobs, have these characteristics, and we're socialized into genders, right? So for me, my family thought that I was a boy because that's what the doctors told them. But I never wanted to do any of the stereotypically male activities. From like literally the age of 3 or 4, I refused to wear boys' clothes, and I insisted on wearing my sister's clothes. And I used to wear my mom's clothes and perform for the local Indian community to the latest Bollywood hits, like drag. And everyone accepted me, actually, because they thought it was just very cute because I was a little kid. It was only when I went to public school and I started to get bullied and harassed because I was too feminine that I began to feel shame for my gender. I never understood that. And then I began to realize I was different because other people were harassing me. So I didn't think I was different before because I was accepted. But then once people started to bully me, then I was like, oh, there's something different about me. I was just having a conversation with my mom, and she told me that when I was 7 years old, when she was tucking me into bed, I said, Mom, I'm queer. And I didn't know queer meant anything around gender or sexuality. I just thought it meant different. So I always had an understanding of myself as different. And I didn't really have the vocabulary to describe what I was because, unfortunately, and I'm trying to change this with my book, unfortunately, we teach people that there's only two options, male or female. So I never grew up knowing that I could just be Alok, that I didn't have to be a man or a woman. And it took me until my 20s to really learn about non-binary and be like, oh my God, that's what I've always been.
Wow. So that was actually going to be my next question about your family. When you first told your parents that you were transgendered, were they receptive? Were they supportive? Or was it hard for them to process?
I think that with these stories, it's always both and. They're just very complicated because there's such emotional attachments to your child. And so many times parents are mourning the sense of like, oh my gosh, my son is no longer my son or whatever. And so there's just the initial period was really hard because my parents were concerned for my safety because they were like, okay, we know that if you dress the ways that you want to dress and if you live the life that you want to live, you could get killed. And I had to tell them, you're right. And I know that, but I still want to be who I am. And so I think for a long time, they would be worried mostly about my safety, but I am so lucky because my family ultimately accepted me because my family is very different than a lot of other families. I grew up in a political household. So my parents are both progressives. And from a young age, I was taught about social justice and social justice values. And so that's kind of rare for Indian American diaspora, but I was lucky in that way. And so my parents already understood that they were supposed to accept me. I think that their concerns were more on unlearning their own transphobia. So being able to look at their child wearing a mini skirt at home and not feeling upset about it, or being able to exist in public with me. Because when people walk around with me in public, everyone's staring at you too. And you have to experience kind of 10% of what I go through, 1% of what I go through every day. And so there'd just be these moments of like being in public with my dad or being in public with my mom, and I could see them be so uncomfortable. But now, years later, they are totally accepting. My dad is so cute. Any show that I do in Texas, he drives over and he works my merchandise table. And there's just all these cute photos. There's these cute photos of me and my like 5-inch heels next to my dad and his like ugly polo t-shirts and Payless shoes. And my mom and I are very close and she accepts me too.
That's amazing. That's so beautiful. They're probably your biggest cheerleaders now.
Yeah, they totally support me because I think that what I got my parents to realize, and I try to tell a lot of other trans people of color this, is this was about my mental health. Like, it is about my gender, but it's mostly about my mental health. I wasn't happy living as a boy. That was just not who I was. And it made me extremely depressed. And so what I told my parents is, you moved to this country so that I could be happy and live a good life. Welcome to my good life. And who I am now is a direct result of all of the time, intention, and labor you put in to get me here. So on the one hand, you say that you want me to be happy. On the other hand, you're not accepting me. That doesn't make sense. And I think my parents were able to understand I am the realization of their dreams.
Wow, that's amazing. I think any person that is going through a transformational change needs a support system, because that is the only way to get the strength and determination not to give up. So now I want to ask you, looking back at everything that you've been through, what would you say has been the lowest point in your life, and what or who helped you overcome that?
Sure. So I attempted suicide when I was 13 years old. And a lot of that was because I didn't have the language or the knowledge to even understand what I was, but I was experiencing so much bullying at school. I was so afraid of getting beaten and harassed and attacked because I was experiencing so much homophobia and transphobia. I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone in my family or in my community because that would out me. And if I was outed, then I'd experience more violence and persecution. And so I just internalized it all. And I fundamentally believed that I was wrong and that there's never going to be a safe space for me, and there was never going to be a possibility for me to live because I would always experience harassment and people would always make fun of me. And what ultimately helped me survive was my writing practice. So I started writing poetry right around that time. And poetry became my best friend because it was where I could process all the things that were happening to me. And fortunately, I still have all of my poems from back then, so I can read them. And what I was really going through, I would just put out onto the page and I'd write and write and write and write. And I'd just cry while writing. And it released something for me because it took the pain out of my body and it made something separate and something beautiful. And that practice of taking my pain and turning it into my art has been how I still survive today.
Wow, that just speaks of the importance of having a vehicle to express your emotions and pain, especially during your lowest point in your life. So you're a multifaceted artist. Where do you get your inspiration?
So I feel like being an artist for me is like kind of being a sponge, that I'm constantly absorbing conversations that I'm having, things that I'm seeing, media that I'm watching. It's important for me to consume as much culture as possible. So that can look like staying up until 4 a.m. watching old trash reality TV, to like reading tons of books, to following a bunch of people on Instagram who inspire me across the world, to reading a lot of history to understand a lot of the ideas that dictate my work, to also just experimenting with makeup and fashion and photography, to going to a lot of theater and seeing a lot of live performers. I'm just constantly watching. But I think that the number one thing that inspires me is people watching. I love living in New York City, and I miss this so much during the pandemic because I would just kind of sit on benches and I would just watch people, or like sit on the train and watch people, or walk around and watch people. And I think that there's a reason why there's so many artists that have come out of New York City, because on the one hand, we're so close to each other, but on the other hand, we're so distant. And it creates this need to understand how people are living their lives, what they think about, what matters to them. And those kinds of speculations, I think, are so integral to what I make.
You have been through a lot of hardship and pain growing up, coming out as a transgender person. I wonder, to what extent has that defined your artistic expression?
You know, I refuse to be defined. So I would say that they inform but never define. And I once had someone ask me after a talk that I gave, she said, "Would you even make art if you didn't experience violence?" And then I was like, would you say that to a white artist? No. There's this way in which people will constantly think that art by people of color is just like our personal experiences of hostility and discrimination. No, babes, we're also speaking about global things like heartbreak. We're speaking about loneliness. We're speaking about the human condition. It's just that the white art world wants to say that we're just writing about our identity. and our experiences of discrimination, but actually we're speaking about universal truths as well.
So I guess a better word would be inspired, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Got it. So let's talk now about fashion. You have been one of the loudest voices in the movement to degender the fashion and beauty industries, even coming out with your own gender-neutral fashion line. Now, just for context, so our audience knows what we're talking about, several large Western fashion houses are starting to embrace genderless fashion, or at least make it seem as they do. But you have been quick to point out that this movement predates their decisions and actually has roots in the trans and genderqueer communities challenging traditional Western fashion norms that were instated to reaffirm the gender binary. So this is my question. Why do you think this narrative is being waxed over in favor of lauding these fashion houses as progressive?
Wow, what a beautiful question. One of my favorite questions I've ever been asked in an interview. Thank you. So Gucci just announced, actually, that it is planning on ceasing to have men's and women's collections. And this is a major victory, and it's a long time coming. And I'm happy, but I'm also frustrated because so often the people who get seen as the pioneers in this conversation tend to be white, European, cisgender people. And that is just historically inaccurate, and I'll explain why. So when European colonizers came to what is now Peru and what is now India, one of the first things that they would write about in their journals is that the local peoples actually were transgressing their ideas of gender, that there were actually many people who were bare-chested women or were, quote, men in skirts, without even asking if those people were women or men, and without even asking if those were skirts. And these were often the first people that were killed by European colonizers. And one of the things that European colonization did is it indoctrinated people into the gender binary of man or woman. And it actually criminalized public gender nonconformity. So in India, they actually made it illegal to, quote, cross-dress in public. The same cross-dressing laws also exist in the United States. And so for me, I say degendering fashion began with indigenous peoples across the world who already were wearing what they wanted to wear, but were punished. I mean, literally in what is now America, indigenous peoples were brought into residential schools and forced to wear boys' clothes and forced to wear girls' clothes. And so it does a disservice when we forget that actually indigenous communities and third world communities, global south communities, have been doing this for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then secondly, when gender neutral fashion makes it to these mainstream fashion houses, they're still only using conventionally attractive, thin, gender conforming models. I have struggled my entire career to get any mainstream fashion companies to work with me. And what they tell me in private is, you're just too much. You're too hairy. You're too visibly gender nonconforming. You're too queer. You're too political. It's just going to be too hard to market you. And so what's happening is that my ideas and my aesthetics make it onto the covers of these magazines, but never my body. And I think that's what I'm trying to actually say, is that if we're going to do gender fashion, which we should, we also need to give credit where it's due, and we need to actually center the leadership of trans and gender nonconforming people. And for me, it's not just enough to put us on runways or put us on magazine covers. I mean, all that's important, but it's also important to educate yourself about our issues, because it is so much safer for me to wear a dress on a runway than it is for me to wear it on the street. And until there's no difference between me wearing a dress on a billboard and me wearing a dress just next to you on a subway, we need to keep on fighting. And what the fashion world actually needs to say is anyone should be able to wear any article of clothing that they want without fearing violence or persecution.
Wow, that is a very powerful answer. Thank you so much for your perspective. And why do you think it's taking society so long to embrace truly unisex, genderless fashion, especially when it comes to certain bodies wearing dresses, skirt, heels, and really other traditional feminine styles?
Right. Well, we're talking about like 1,000+ year construction. No, not 1,000, maybe a couple 100-year construction that has had millions, if not billions of dollars of propaganda that has made a cultural choice, because dividing billions of people into two genders is a cultural choice, not a biological fact, that has taken a cultural choice and indoctrinated millions of people into it as if it's natural and as if it's reality. And so when I'm saying, hey, a man in a dress might not even be a man, people look at me like, are you serious? That's not real. And they don't understand that their conception of reality is propaganda that was actually force-fed as part of a colonial ideology. And so for me, degendering is actually about decolonizing. It's about actually saying the majority of people across the world didn't divide their peoples into two genders. And in fact, many cultures across the world celebrated gender nonconforming people as religious icons and as spiritual icons. But all that history got lost, and that legacy got lost because of European imperialism. And so at its heart, when I'm asking for this, I'm asking for people to relearn hundreds of years of priming. And people don't want to do that because people hold on to what they know to be familiar. But the issue is that what is familiar should actually be what is strange, and what is strange should actually be what is familiar. There's nothing more natural than people having the choice of their body, of what they're wearing, of how they adorn themselves. What is unnatural is society policing and discriminating against people for what they wear, right? So I'm trying to get people to unlearn so many of these toxic ideas and actually relearn how to relate to one another. And that's going to take time. I get it. But I think what's really frustrating to me in my career is people always dismiss me as an idealist or as too utopic in my thinking. And it's like, how do you think we've made any change ever? Do you think that any political artist historically was like, the way that I'm going to make change is by just keeping quiet? Absolutely not. The people that I look up to recognized that they had to keep on struggling to get their message across, because even after they died, no one would forget what they were saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's a constant fight. It's so hard to put yourself in a position where you're going to receive a lot of criticism. It really takes courage, determination, most importantly, a strong sense of purpose and conviction that you need to be part of that change.
Right. I think that when I'm speaking at a lot of colleges and universities, what I really try to tell people is I truly believe that everyone has a purpose. And a lot of times we've been distracted from our purpose because so often people give us advice that is actually so bad. They're just projecting their own stuff out onto you. And that advice ends up making us take jobs that we don't want to take, making us end up with partners we don't want to be with, move to cities we don't want to be a part of. But when you actually focus on your own life and ask yourself, what do I actually want? You can unlock your own creative purpose. And for me, my purpose is this movement. Every single day I experience harassment and violence that people couldn't even fathom. Just for posting a photo of myself, I have thousands of people say that I should be burned in hell, that they should send me to the concentration camps, that they should light this faggot on fire, that I deserve to be exterminated, that I am a disgrace to the human race. I experience extreme pushback in person, online, everywhere I go. But the reason that I persist through that is because I know fundamentally that I am right and this is my purpose. And people ask me, how do you have such a strong purpose? That's where I think it's really important to educate ourselves about our ancestors. We always think that we're the first person to say something or do something, but that's not true. There's always been people who have been dissidents in society. And I started to learn and educate myself about the history of trans people. And what I learned is for hundreds and thousands of years, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, trans and gender nonconforming people have been here and have been fighting this fight. So I'm actually just taking up the mantle. I'm not inventing something new. I'm not an innovator. I am actually continuing a legacy. And when you're part of a legacy, you feel less lonely.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners are inspired by your words of wisdom, and they're going to want to find their sense of purpose. So now let's talk about your art. In many ways, art has always been political. What does it mean for you to be an artist, a creator, during times of particular political turmoil such as now? Do you feel more responsibility to respond even though you put yourself at risk of incurring emotional trauma?
I feel like I have a more clarified understanding of my role as an artist during this crisis than ever before. Because every time I read what this administration is saying, I'm like, okay, my job as an artist is to counter all of this and is to offer an alternative to all of this. Our president literally said on record that the United States would have done a good job if less than 200,000 people died from the coronavirus. That is horrifying. That is literally one of the biggest thefts of human life in this country. I mean, of course, there was much bigger when it came to genocide of indigenous people, and that can't be forgotten. And when I'm hearing that number 200,000, what I'm seeing is the reduction of human life to a number. And my job as an artist is to insist that people cannot be reduced to data, that people are actually complicated and live many lives and love many people and have so much genius and intelligence and worth. And therefore, my job as an artist is to be a funeral worker, is to grieve for people who cannot grieve right now, is to create the material for people to actually access their pain. Because the way that state violence works is we desensitize ourselves to our pain. So that when we hear about a new injustice, like Haitian immigrants being deported back to Haiti in the middle of a pandemic, when we hear about ICE continuing to detain people in the middle of a pandemic, we still are like, this is outrageous, this is unacceptable. But I think people are disciplined into feeling like there's no hope. And the reason that they don't have hope or empathy is because they've had to separate themselves from their own emotions. And my job as an artist is to reconnect people with their own emotions. It's to make people believe that there's another way to live.
I completely agree with you. These are very uncertain times. So I wanted to ask you, you have been an advocate for body positivity and mental health awareness, particularly for trans and genderqueer people who have been consistent targets for conservative attacks. What would you say to those people who are feeling discouraged or perhaps even hopeless from how much social and bureaucratic pushback they're receiving? Especially now as several states are pushing for more anti-LGBTQ legislation.
I just want to say I so appreciate these questions. You told me before that I would be impressed, but I really am. It's so gratifying to actually have a media outlet that is trying to educate itself about these issues. Because so often when I speak, people are so surprised about the severity of the situation. And the truth is, we are seeing a legal onslaught against trans people that is unprecedented. And no one seems to care. And it's heartbreaking that there have been over 20 states in 2020 alone that have introduced anti-LGBTQ legislation, often targeting trans and gender nonconforming young people, already some of the most vulnerable people in our society, who have higher suicide rates than anyone else, higher rates of discrimination and harassment, are now being targeted by the government. It's heartbreaking. And I receive dozens of messages all the time from young LGBTQ people who are suffering, who are wanting to die, who are being harassed. I receive photos of people getting attacked, being like, hey, I just got bashed in downtown Seattle. What do I do? And it's just devastating because the narrative that this government is giving us about LGBT rights is that, we have gay marriage, so we're equal. That couldn't be farther from the truth. When you look at the situation of trans and gender nonconforming people, and especially Black and brown trans and gender nonconforming people in this country, you see some of the most severe forms of discrimination and violence with no media coverage, no public sympathy. And so it feels impossible for a lot of members of my community. But what I really want to tell people who might be listening and who are struggling right now is you are part of a sacred legacy of people who have been persecuted for the truth. They are making you think that your gender is a lie, but actually their gender norms are the lie. You actually are divine and powerful. And the reason that they're persecuting you is because they are intimidated by your power. And they're making you conceal your magic with their shame. Don't perpetuate their shame. The things that they've taught you to feel shame about in yourself are actually your most magical parts. And what you'll soon realize is that the weird parts, the idiosyncratic parts, the parts of you that don't fit into the boxes, those are the parts that will, like compasses, guide you to the people in your life that deserve you and that love you for you. Not for your ability to be a stereotype, not for your ability to disappear yourself, but for you. There's so much love waiting for you. Don't give up.
Absolutely. What a powerful message. Thank you so much for that. So now let's talk about your book that you just released called Beyond the Gender Binary. You've particularly been very focused on educating and advocating for queer youth through your platform. And in your book, you focus on some of your experiences as a gender non-conforming person to illustrate that gender is complex and self-determined. How would having a book like Beyond the Gender Binary have impacted you as a child, especially considering your own upbringing by a brown family in conservative Texas?
Yeah, it would have changed my life 100% because I didn't even know that I was possible. Like, I always say this. There's a lot of conversation about representation in the media, how it's very difficult to grow up as, say, a young immigrant kid in this country because you have such stereotypical representations in media. When you're a non-binary person, you have no representation at all. At least when you're growing up as an immigrant, you have your parents. But when you're a young non-binary person, you don't have anyone. So you genuinely feel like there's no one else in the world like you at all. I genuinely felt that I was the only person in the world ever that felt things that I was feeling. If I had had a book that actually was a portal to knowing that there were other people like me, it would have saved me in so many ways. And then secondly, what this book does is it articulates all the arguments that are used to restrict trans rights. All the arguments that people say against us to delegitimize us. And it gives us the rebuttals on how to respond to them. And I was very intentional about this because I wanted to create a handbook so that people could advocate for themselves. What's really frustrating to me right now is that most of the knowledge around trans people is introductory. It's here's what pronouns are, here's what non-binary is. There's no literature about the discrimination that we're facing and what we can do about it. And so I wanted to create a guidebook for people to actually be able to mobilize these ideas. Yes, of course, we should learn about pronouns, but we should also be politicized because there's legislation and there's targeted attacks of our community. And so what I'm hoping with this book is that it's going to create a generation, it's going to help, because they already exist, a generation of youth activists to speak out against anti-LGBTQ sentiment. And that's why, as part of my book launch this week, I've partnered up with community organizations across the country that work with LGBTQ youth in places like Alabama, Wyoming, Idaho, Iowa, Mississippi, to distribute the 5,000 copies of this book to LGBTQ youth and as part of their political education curriculums at these centers. Because for me, it's not enough to just have adults reading this book. I want everyone to be reading this book.
Yes, everyone needs to get that book. So where can they get the information? Is it in Amazon? Where's it available right now?
Yeah, sure. It's available everywhere books are sold. And if people want to support me directly, they can get it through my website.
Perfect. The link to the book is also included on Alok's feature story on our website, so make sure you check out blendtw.com. So now I want to dissect your talk on genderless fashion featured because it was the best 15 minutes of my life. You generally have a gift not only for speaking in front of an audience, but for captivating and moving people with your words. So there are two excerpts from your talk that I want to share with our audience. The first excerpt that stood out to me is the following. People tell me that I'm brave for being myself, but I'm not. Frankly, I'm terrified and exhausted. But I keep going anyways because I believe it should not require bravery to do something as simple as being yourself. That excerpt really resonated to my core, and I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way because we go through life wearing masks. Everyone, whether you're transgendered or you are straight, it doesn't matter. We all go through life wearing masks, hiding our true selves for multiple reasons. Whether it's because we want validation from others, we want people to like us, we want people to think that we're strong. Basically, all human beings are scared to show vulnerability. That is something ingrained in us. So how do we change that? What tangible tip do you have for anyone out there struggling right now with that?
Yeah, totally. This is why I believe that the trans movement is for everyone. Because when I think about what I did in my life, is I knew that I could have so much more access to safety, that I could have so much more access to stability and to love if I lived a lie. But I said, I am willing to give up everything. I'm willing to jump into the fire. I literally write about this in my book. There was a moment when I brought all my friends together and I said, I can't do this anymore. I feel so unhappy not being able to express myself, and I'm petrified because I need to express my femininity more, and I'm scared that I'm going to experience a lot of pushback, and I need your help. And I made that moment, and I just never went back. And I literally started wearing dresses almost every single day and like just being spat out on the streets. And like everyone was trying to get me to stop. And there have been so many times I've wanted to give up. But what I ultimately realized is I am proud of myself. I look in front of the mirror every single day and say, I am proud of the life that I'm living. I love the person that I am. I celebrate who I am. And I know who I am. And I would never give that up for the world. And that's why I think that trans and gender nonconforming people are leaders for every movement, because we teach people that there is nothing more important than that sense, that emotional sense of being like, I am integrated and I am aligned. My heart, my mind, my body, and my soul are all together, because that's what I bring. And that's what I bring to my speeches. That's what I bring to my performances. I bring my full self. We're so used to experiencing people in easily digestible parts, but I bring all of me, my unruliness, my loneliness, my pain, my anguish, my joy, my triumph. And I want people to be able to know all of themselves, because I feel like people have been told that they're only lovable if it's conditional. And I'm not interested in that kind of conditional love. And so what I say to people is, yes, it's going to be hard. You're going to experience backlash. People are going to persecute you. People are going to doubt you and delegitimize you. But there's also a filtration process. You're going to filter out all the people who don't need to be part of your life. All the toxic energy, you're going to be able to be like, that person, no, they need to go. And you're going to end up on the other side with the people you've been looking for your entire life.
Wow, that is so powerful. There is actually this other excerpt from your talk on Fashion's Genderless feature that resonated to my core. And this is what you said. There is no loneliness like having people see you after you have erased yourself. When you said that, it honestly gave me chills, because there are so many people that are lost in the eyes of the world. And what do I mean by that? Basically, in our quest of acceptance and validation, we lose ourselves. We lose ourselves to relationships. We sacrifice our desires to make other people happy, to have the perfect job, without realizing that what we're doing is that we're giving away our power. We're giving away our essence. It comes to a point that we no longer know who we are. That is why there's so many people in our society that are so unhappy, even though they seem to have everything. So this is my question to you. What is the biggest piece of advice you have for someone out there that is not living an authentic life? Someone that it's surviving, not thriving, and they feel that there's no way out.
There's always a crack in every foundation. Nothing is permanent, and every surface is much more rugged than it appears. And when we say there's no way out, okay, there's no way out maybe for people who are incarcerated, for people who are in immigrant detention, for people who are detained. I'm not going to deny that. But for those of us who are not in prison and are not in domestic violence situations, there is a way out. And it's that what the real point is, we're going to lose things if we get out. That's, I think, what's haunting that question. And I want to say, yes, we are going to lose things. We're going to lose people that love us. We're going to lose stability. But that loss is also another beginning. What I've learned is that death is rebirth, that actually sometimes things have to burn in order for things to grow, and that actually we are constantly shedding skins. And like snakes, we slither through those cracks and we abandon a skin and we become something else. In our lives, we live many lives. But I really believe that our spirituality has to be our North Star. And our bodies teach us, our intuition teaches us, I'm not happy here. I'm not me here. And so follow that North Star out. Get out.
Absolutely. Get out. Follow your instinct, follow your heart, because you know what? They unconsciously already know what you really want. Well, that is a wrap. Thank you so much, Alok, for your time. Your words are honestly music to our ears. Thank you so much for everything. Keep up the amazing work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for staying with us today. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss out our next episodes. We have an incredible lineup of guests, so you're not going to want to miss it out. Also, make sure you check us out at blendtw.com and follow us on social media at blendtw to get your daily dose of inspiration and learn more about other stories of resilience and courage. See you soon.